Hello. Hi, love. Welcome back to our
Hello.
episode. Our 10th episode on this series. We've done quite a bit of them now.
Yay! We're about, what, a third of the way through or something? I don't know. Maybe
Something.
not.
Well, we're getting
Almost.
into the second section of the book. That's what we're doing today.
Mhm.
Beautiful book. And we finished up the first section, which was on all the pillars. We ended that on the evolution of the system, which was really fun to do. It was nice to hear the story of how everything came up. And now we get into descriptive metaphysics. That's what the whole section is about.
Totally. Yeah, and actually, this is a good place to lead off because you sort of got to the garden and was like, oh, there's a garden, and right in the middle of that garden's that meme flower, at least emerges as a. And that's when I really realized that what I was missing in my conception of philosophy was a proper understanding of metaphysics, actually. And that if you go back to my original essay in 2003 in the Tree of Knowledge, I say, hey, there's a problem of epistemology here.
Right.
That's how I basically thought of philosophy is like, oh, how do we know and how do we justify knowledge? And that's the problem of philosophy. I didn't have a good understanding really of epistemology relative to ontology, and I definitely didn't have a good understanding of the proper way to conceptualize metaphysics. And then when I realized that there's a whole thing called descriptive metaphysics, I realized, gosh, that's what I've been doing. A lot of what
Right.
I
And
work
you
on, I've
find
been
out
doing
after
is
the
like, oh my
fact.
God, after the fact, like that's what if I was well trained in philosophy from the beginning. Although actually, even philosophy doesn't really. Well, many philosophers don't think about it this way. Although it's certainly proper too. So it's a lovely transition, and I think that's a good bridge. And yes, descriptive
That's fun.
metaphysics.
That's funny. Last time we talked about how with the UTOK, like a lot of the ideas sort of build themselves, right? It's
Mhm.
like you're in some way discovering them. And that's an interesting one too. Like you were doing descriptive metaphysics all the way through, and then you learned the concept, and you're like, oh, that's what
That's what
that
I'm
was.
doing. Right, exactly. It
Now,
happens with
now you
meta
have like a
modern. It
very
happens with many things, but that's exactly what happens
right,
with
right. The
philosophy.
garden was sincerely ironic, all the
Totally, I
way
didn't
back in
before I knew
16.
what that was. Exactly.
Right. All right. Anyway, so that's fun. So descriptive metaphysics, interestingly enough, the meme flower does encapsulate a lot of what the concept of the descriptive metaphysics is, right? And there's the content parts of the descriptive metaphysics of UTOK, which in full form are the tree of knowledge system, the map of mind, the periodic table of behavior, right? And the Aquat coin is also part of that. I actually have that up
Hmm.
on my
Yep.
pictures.
Yes,
That's
there it is.
the
That's
topic.
exactly right.
Right. And the meme flower talks about metaphysics and empiricism. So we'll get into all of that, but
Lovely.
it's nice how descriptive metaphysics organizes a lot of the
Right.
UTOK ideas.
So, and let's start then right away. Obviously, you and I know more than maybe I guess anybody that you talk is very grounded. It is not woo. It's not against that per se. But it's just not what it's about, and we can open up questions. People hear the term metaphysics and they think woo. I mean, our friend Jim Rutt, reaches for his pistol when he hears it, right? As that. So when you hear the term metaphysics, you're like, oh, physics is science, and then science is about what's empirically real, and then there's this thing called metaphysics, which is then learned or crazy or interesting speculation about what's outside of the empirical universe. That's the way many people think of the concept of metaphysics. It's like there's obviously this cup that's empirically real, and then where are we, and are there angels, and is there God, and that's metaphysics. Okay, so that's the way the word got used now, and outside of refined academic circles. So the first thing I want to say, that's not the way we're using the term here. We're not using the term say, oh, there's physics, and then we're wondering about the speculative nature of the world. No, actually, what do you mean by physics? Yeah, what do you mean by physics? That's what we mean by metaphysics. It's the question about what are the terms, what we're using, what are the concepts and categories that we're using, how do they network together to describe the empirical world. That's not an empirical question. And it's not even a logical question, I would argue, although it brings logic into it. So descriptive metaphysics refers to the way in which you are using concepts and categories to network your set of assumptions about the world and how you know it. That is the core, and that's really the proper definition of metaphysics can certainly fit there. And then when you add the word, Strawson is the one who came up with the word descriptive metaphysics. Okay, And if it's both, is this really valid? You're a psychologist. What do you know about philosophy? Apparently, there's a lot I need to learn. But did I back into this in a way that's valid? And the first thing I'll point to is read Lawrence Cahoon's The Orders of Nature. He is a philosopher trained in metaphysics. He's the president of the Metaphysical Association, or was at one point, so that's his whole professional identity. In that book, from a philosophical vantage point in 2014, he writes about how we need a big system perspective that's grounded in metaphysical considerations, just meaning the logical interrelations of concepts and categories that delineate what the world is and how we know about it. In fact, his Orders of Nature is a remarkable parallel to the Tree of Knowledge. And he is a metaphysician. And so that philosophy trained as, and argues that philosophy lost its way. It should be doing big picture, what he called systematic metaphysics. That's a descriptive metaphysical system for the concepts and categories, how they relate. For him, how do you create the orders of nature? Oh, these are the layers of ontology and the planes of existence that I'm talking about. Exactly the same thing. And so when I was stumbling on, then I came across him, and then I was like, oh my gosh, this is not accidental. This is a real vacancy in our knowledge. There's a real root of understanding that allows us to fill it. You can point to his work. He sees how it opens up. In fact, he calls the bipolar split of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy and between mind and matter. That would be like the Enlightenment gap. So there's a parallel which creates a lot of convergent validity. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying I know I'm outside my psychology territory here, but you can point to a refined, excellent professional philosopher who saw the exact same thing that I did.
That's interesting that he saw that in philosophy. You saw it in psychology first, right? How psychology was missing that big picture, coherent definition of core concepts and categories. So things like that are really central to psychology, like mind and behavior, and those words that thrown around everywhere, right? In several different traditions, many different schools of thought will use those concepts, and they'll use them to define the very core of what they think psychology is about. And yet there's all this pluralism in how these terms are defined. So for UTOK, since it's coming from psychology, it's really important to define the concepts that are core to psychology, right? And that's what it does with mind, and then we get the map of mind. It does it to behavior, then we get the periodic table of behavior. And so that's what it's about, right? Getting those core definitions well defined. It's not about conjecturing about things that are outside the natural world, but it's about staying in the natural world and really structuring it and defining it well. I did want to bring up my prop with this map of philosophy, right, that we related to the meme flower of UTOK here. And it brings up concepts like ontology, epistemology, then it brings different branches of philosophy like politics, aesthetics, ethics. But ontology and epistemology are really core concepts, right, to talk about when we mentioning descriptive metaphysics. So let's clarify what those really are and how to not get them confused or conflated with one another, which it's a sneak peek into the problem of psychology, right, which does exactly that.
Totally. Right. So what you see there is on the outside of that circle, on the top side, there's metaphysics, and on the bottom side, there's empirical. That's metaphysical. So that's what are the concepts and categories that can organize our experience, and experience then empirical. Empirical is contact with data that gives you any kind of sense making. So it's pulling data into senses. So I see a cup at some level. But then I have to then bind my understanding, really your cultured person justificatory philosophical understanding of what a cup is, what am I seeing, how do I know, what's the difference between appearance and reality. That then is going to then create a model of sense making. The overarching landscape is the metaphysical organizing empirical, okay? Then we get inside of the structure, and then you get the great branches of philosophy. That's actually, and I can't remember, we pulled that from an integral theorist or a guy that generated the first element, and then we sort of expanded it and put the metaphysical empirical around it. At the bottom of that, and boxed in, is ontology and epistemology, okay? And these are the two foundational, so if we start with the metaphysical empirical, with the fundamental question of philosophy, is like, what are the concepts and categories we need for sense making? And then the issue is, well, there's in fundamental issues of knowledge and knowers. and then knowers know about the world, then that becomes epistemology, generate justified knowledge about reality, and then that's your theory of reality's ontology that then gets into the ontic. Okay, so then this box says there's epistemic, which are knowing processes, that can be refined into an epistemology that then says this is how you know and this is what justified knowledge is, about reality, because it has to then, it's corresponding at some level. If you have a thought about reality, it's true because of reality. So you have to have a theory of reality that's still in your head, that's ontology, and then that connects to the ontic, which is the term then for what's real independent of how you're thinking about it. So those are the network of things. I used to think philosophy was just mostly epistemology. I didn't really understand you needed to consider ontology and metaphysics as well in relation. So those are the definitions of the concepts. Our Now You Talking series, I think, does a good job of explaining those. And if you understand the history of psychology, okay, you can go back to the history of psychology and realize through this lens that psychology struggled with ontology at first. Okay, meaning that psychology tried to say this is what a soul is. Okay, and relationship to, say, physics. This is what the mind is, consciousness is. This is where we should carve nature at its joints. Those are ontological questions. They're saying this is what my map of reality is. Okay, but it's being tied to the physical sciences. So there's both a sort of ontological commitment at some level that says, well, if physics is this way and chemistry is this way, and we have to tie to that, there's an ontological commitment. Mm-hmm. And there's the methods of science. Okay, the methods of science means we're going to look at stuff systematically from a third-person behavioral view. We're going to measure stuff. We're going to test ideas, and we're going to recursively analyze those ideas for their validity. That's what the methods of science are. Okay. Now, psychology is trying to do both originally, meaning it's trying to get an ontology, it's trying to bound into them. And the crisis of psychology, in my estimation, the best way to interpret, that's the whole history of like, what is psychology? And the Freudians say one, and the behaviorists say other, and the cognitivists say this, and blah, blah, blah. And then you get the crisis. That's the failure of us to clarify ontologically what we mean by our referent. Like, what in the thing in the world? Is it mind? Is it behavior? And how do they relate? Is it animals all the way down into organisms? Or is it just higher animals? Or is it just humans that are, that would be an ontological referent. And this field never solves that. And ultimately it becomes a science, okay, because it starts to really systematically apply the methods of measurement, observation, third person, empirical. In other words, it's a methods-based approach to the world, ultimately.
So the methods are like the structure that holds up the building of the institution of psychology, right? So psychology becomes a science because it applies these methods. It does that in an institutionally organized way, right? So that it confers degrees, it has conferences, all the stuff that psychology does. But really the question of the ontology, which is not like it was ignored, right? It was sought after, but it was not consolidated in a consensus among the entire field. That question is left out, right? And that's how the crisis turns into a big problem.
Right. Well, the crisis gets swept, the ontological crisis is swept under the rug. Then you're told that, if you really want some big theory, it's because you really want to kill your father, at least psychodynamically, and you have some need to be important. We've tried to answer this question. It's not an answerable question. All you can do is carve it up into small little parts, methods-based parts, ask. And so in James Madison, for example, at the undergraduate level, before you really take any content courses, you have to take, I think, 3 courses of methods. You have to understand measurement and statistics, etc. Because that's the identity of a scientific psychologist, is somebody that understands how experimentation, internal, external validity, ANOVAs, and measurement issues that decide objectively what it is that we're looking at when you slice the world this way. That's the lens of a science. It's methods based. And that's why I said, actually, as a scientist early on, it's a question of epistemology, like how you know. Actually, no, it's also a question, of course, you can't really reduce your world, and this is actually an epistemic fallacy, to epistemology. You have to make ontological commitments ultimately. It turns out the field of psychology didn't think you need to, and so it just committed to methods. It's a methods-based field in terms of its identity as a science.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty widespread, right? In American academic psychology, not just James Madison. I mean, you take the stats courses. that's more fundamental in the structure of the curriculum than courses on theory. I mean, that's almost
Virtually
that's
all. So you look at it, the issue there, you're absolutely right. And you go to textbooks, and I encourage what you'll see in most textbooks. First off, some of them will still be the science of behavior. Some of them will be science of human behavior. Some of them will be mind of behavior. So is mind, like what is mind? Is that
right.
included? And then the most common definition, and I can point to, I think he's the highest selling text guy, is David Myers, and he defines psychology as a science of behavior and mental process. That's the standard view. And you measure behaviors, and then you infer mental processes, and you apply the scientific method. Behaviors, what you have access to. Then you infer constructs and mental ideas about what's the hidden cause of behavior that binds the initial state to the later state. Oh, there's an inference of a mental cause. We do studies on that based on what we can see relative to what we can infer. That's the methods. And he will say right away, the most important word in the science of mental behavior and behavior and mental process is science. We apply the methods of science to these questions. And my essay, actually,
the other sciences.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Other scientific disciplines just take that for granted, right?
Well, I mean, they're science, right? We believe in the methods of science, and now this is the thing we're interested in. And one of the things I'll point out to say is like, other sciences aren't interested in behavior, right? It's like, what is when Newton watched the apple drop. And then realized that the way in which the moon rotated around the earth was the same kind of, wait for it, he's action, but by action he meant behavior, the change in the observable change in object field relation. And physics is the science of behavior and energy and matter in space-time fields. And then you get the behavior of molecules and structure of matter and chemistry, and then you get the behavior of living organisms.
Right? Let's bring up the PPT real quick, because it does precisely that, right? It lists the organization of behaviors according to the planes of existence, right? And by parts, wholes, and groups. And it does that for each plane. Each of these planes of existence are, and if people focus here on the last row, each of these planes of existence will have different types of behavioral processes being enacted, including mind, which is, the plane of psychology that we've been talking about. Anyway, I'm glad that you brought up the epistemic fallacy, just going back to that, because I think that's a good way to define what psychology, the error that psychology was making. And I'm glad that you also brought integral theory, because there's a really cool blog that I can link in the description where you talk about how Wilbur made this mistake, right?
Right. So let me Right. So the first person who labels this is Roy Bhaskar, and he talks about it in the context of Kant. And he basically argues that Kant's transcendental idealism essentially reduces ontology to epistemology. Okay, and that's one major epistemic fallacy. And then he argues that actually Kant implies to have logical consistency inside the entire structure of argument. And be consistent requires a particular kind of view of nature, which he calls the stratified layer of nature, and requires the idea that as part of that stratification is humans getting together and justifying things. Extended naturalism, the work that I do with John, makes this case exactly that you can't reduce. So any system that would reduce all ontology to human epistemological categories, and whether Kant really does this or not, you debate. Kantian scholars would almost certainly fire back. But the Bhaskar critique, which I think is legitimate, another error that happens that's related to this is epistemological and ontological conflation that really confuses is both Wilbur and John Watson, interestingly enough, given how different they are. And I write a blog about that. So John Watson, I'll start there. He, of course, wanted psychology to be a science, but what he did is he actually conflated the methods and ontology of science, meaning the way he interpreted ontology, and basically said, oh, science says that everything is physical and we can measure it and observe it. Both of those things. And thus, to be a science, psychology had to get rid of anything that was immaterial, like mind, and engage in measurement. And thus, he reduced, by definition, his idea of science to both the method and the ontology that all we are nervous systems. Okay? And so he conflated and confused ontology and epistemology, didn't separate out. Wilber, interestingly enough, does sort of a similar thing. When you look at his quadrants, and he's asking questions about the ontology of the quadrants, Wilber argues that actually the only real unique ontological entity exists inside of entities on the left side of the quadrant. Okay, he argues that fundamentally what's really happening here is the emergence of spirit, basically, inside of entities that afford a particular stacking of spiritual experience. That's where all of the novelty is happening. Okay, and thus he actually draws a line and says, well, actually, the magic is happening inside of entities. That's where soul spirit really resides, as opposed to between entities. So he lists the exterior side, the behavioral side of the quadrants, as just being matter. Okay? UTOK says no way. UTOK says what's actually emerging at the level of life, mind, and culture are communication networks. Okay, that exists inside of nodes at one level, their information processing node like a cell, but also then networked into a complex adaptive emanating system like life. Okay, so that this conversation isn't the case that I just drop matter, my words just don't disappear into matter and then miraculously appear in your soul. But in fact, there's a culture person plane of existence. And yes, there's a difference between the communication between our mind 1B, mind 3B, versus, but to call it matter, okay, as opposed to recognizing that it's an emergent emanating property in a context that's dialectically behaving, okay, is a mistake, because that's actually a substance reduction error. Both Wilson and Wilber make an ontological substance reduction error, and I think based on both the errant conflations between epistemology and ontology. UTOK says we need a behavioral epistemology for science, but that shouldn't result in equating that with a reductive materialism. Behavioral epistemology is totally different than a reductive materialism ontologically. And in fact, UTOK embraces a behavioral epistemology for science, but is absolutely not a reductive materialistic ontology.
So that extension, right? Because you're doing extended naturalism so much that that word is in my head, but it extends ontology such that it can hold the different epistemologies. And then that way, the different epistemologies, the core pillars that we talked about, they all are real and they're part of the natural complexification of the universe, right? And they're just different ways of knowing about it. But there is an ontology that is stratified and that is evolving, emerging, that can hone those epistemologies. And that's really important because in that way you relate ontology and epistemology, but you don't get them confused and you don't get them all bundled up into a single thing. So I think that
one of the things about that's exactly right, and that's what why as UTOK, we can ask you and I, especially if you know the history of this, we can ask, well, why is UTOK coming at this so differently? Greg's not trained as a philosopher, but he's inside of psychology, yet he's now sort of rediscovering aspects or pointing to a small set of some philosophers like Lawrence Calhoun's that's doing this really cool work that should have been done a long time ago. This is vacant. Why does Gregg have a particular angle, or UTOK has a particular on this kind of issue? Well, remember what justification, the hypothesis and systems theory fundamentally is about. It argues that the evolution of propositional language creates the problem of justification, which essentially is the problem of epistemology, right? What's knowledge, propositional knowledge, and what's justified true belief, to use the Plato version, that justified true belief is the problem. What UTOK tells us is, we now have a map of the world ontologically that points where propositional epistemology evolves from. So we get the ontology of epistemology and no other system. And that is a wonderfully powerful transition between these two concepts that I didn't appreciate before because I didn't have metaphysics and ontology to complement epistemology because I wasn't trained. But now in retrospect, you're like, wow.
The really cool trippy loop is that UTOK itself is a justification system, right? And through epistemologically, it discovers, invents, creates the ontology of that, right, of justification. So it's able to organize that really neatly.
Amen.
So I guess we can conclude that descriptive metaphysics is not woo. That's a good message.
That's right. So, in a nutshell, UTOK then, the last thing I'll say is the first book I dialogue about this, the fundamental project's a meta-theoretical project. And what I'm doing there is I'm looking at the schools of thought, the absence of a paradigm, and the argument that there's a way to assimilate and integrate the key insights into a meta theory, which basically binds these together and creates a causal explanatory framework for human behavior. That's what the unified theory of psychology really is. And it says this is why it's been absent, and this is how you fix it with these. First, we get a big picture view, and then we go from there and create a meta theoretical synthesis. The second book actually says, well, there's actually this whole other layer. And that's this fundamental question about what is science, right? What is behavior? What is mind? And of course, these are the absolute central concepts of psychology, and we have no descriptive metaphysical system that binds these concepts together at a definitional level of the concepts and categories. And so the tree of knowledge system, the periodic table of behavior, and the map of mind then serve as a descriptive metaphysical system for science mapping nature, okay? A specification of the layers and levels of behavior, clarifying a dimension of mindedness that then can be divided, as we'll talk about, into inside and out, interior, exterior, epistemological perspective, and across the stack of mind 1, 2, 3. We'll have a whole section on that. But now with that, and by the way, in the background, there's the whole coin for psyche. All of these things, right? All of these things give us a descriptive metaphysics, ultimately for first person, second person, and third person epistemological vectors, the intersubjective, objective, that can be now bound together and now applied to the science of psychology to clarify what we mean. Oh, it should be basic psychology is the science of mental behavior. We can locate that on the tree of knowledge. We can see how that evolved. Human psychology then jumps into the culture person plane of existence on the individual. Those are ontological claims. Then we can bring epistemological behavioral science methods to ask questions about that. But now we are actually in a place where we can answer the question, what's the ontological structure of psychology? Oh, we have a descriptive metaphysics for science, behavior, and mind to achieve that.
Beautiful. So it does that, for psychology, it does that for our large scale knowledge systems, and it does that for the small me, the small metaphysical empirical that's embedded in each one of us individually, right? And it connects to the psyche, ultimately it connects to the psyche. And it gives it an ontological clarity about how it emerges in nature, and what its epistemology is, which is a different epistemology and is just as real as the other epistemologies, right? So it does that with fluidity, I would say, theoretical fluidity.
I'd love to hear that. I believe so. And in so doing, we are now in a position to address and resolve the Enlightenment gap.
Lovely. All right, that's a lot of fun. We're going to get into the actual elements of the descriptive metaphysics of it in the next episodes. And this has been fun. It's always fun to do these with you.
It's always fun to do it with you. Love you. All right, see you in a bit.